Hi, everyone. I'm Michelle Jobin, and you are listening to Time to Talk, a podcast for caregivers. This podcast is dedicated to helping family caregivers in Ontario. Through expert tips and resources, you will gain knowledge and validation for the ups and downs that come with caregiving. More importantly, you'll learn that you're not alone. It's so important to take this time for yourself. We're glad you're here. Today, we are joined by Carla Velastegui. Carla's caregiving journey began in 2011 when her mother was diagnosed with early-onset Parkinson's disease. As part of an immigrant family, Carla became her mother's advocate and managed both caregiving and career growth in healthcare technology. Her experiences have fueled her advocacy for caregiver-friendly workplaces and support systems. Carla, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Hi, Michelle. Thank you for having me here today.
I'm so happy to have this conversation with you today on Time to Talk. This is a place where we want to create this space for Ontario caregivers to connect and share. And hopefully, through our conversation today, we can gain a little bit more insight into your journey and learn about the importance of advocating for working caregivers, which is so many of us, right? So I think a lot of people will find much that they can, see themselves in with your story. So I wanted to begin at the beginning of your caregiving journey. When do you think that you first became a caregiver? When would you first define that?
Yeah, so I think for me, that was in my early teens when my mother was diagnosed with early onset Parkinson's disease in her mid 40s. And back then, we had immigrated a few years ago. And as my father became the sole provider for the family, I naturally became the person that would accompany my mom to her appointments, kind of making sure that she was understanding what was going on with her, the diagnosis and her care plan, translating, and then really supporting kind of that continuity of care at home, where we would just make sure that, she was staying on top of meds and on top of any changes that we needed to communicate with the providers. And as her condition progressed and as more changes started to happen, then that also kind of led into me really jumping into more of the management of kind of financial and legal affairs. And of course, throughout this whole journey, really providing that emotional support and that companionship on what can be a really lonely and also scary situation navigating a new diagnosis and in a whole new country where you're so unfamiliar to a healthcare system.
I mean, there's lots of layers there. First of all, you were so young. How
Yes.
old were you?
So I was between 12, 13. It was when I was
Wow.
kind of helping my mom navigate the healthcare system and helping her, translate and just making sure that she understood what was happening with her health.
That is a lot for someone at any age, but certainly at the age of 12 or 13. But I certainly understand what you're talking about when you describe the situation that your family was in. It makes absolute sense. And you touched on a little bit about the fact that your family had just immigrated relatively recently prior to this situation starting. So, as part of an immigrant family, do you feel that there are unique dynamics or expectations that influenced your role as a caregiver? And did you feel any particular responsibility or pressure that someone else might not feel?
Well, I think for us, there are definitely cultural components that impact how I approach kind of caregiving and supporting my mom. I think a big part is within my culture. Caring for a loved one is deeply ingrained into who we are. And so when my mom got her diagnosis, I would say for us, it wasn't just a diagnosis for her, but it was really a whole diagnosis for the whole family. So it was really a question of how are we going to figure this out together and navigate this new chapter as a family. And so it for me never really felt like a forced role per se, but it was just something more for me that as a daughter, I wanted to step in. I wanted to be able to be there for my mom and help her navigate this new unknown diagnosis. And I think especially for us, we didn't have a large support network to lean on or kind of extended family that was there to help us out. So for me, it was just really important to be there for my mom and to be able to step in and support her throughout this diagnosis.
Well, when it comes to your mom herself, obviously she got this diagnosis probably earlier, of course, in sort of the journey and symptoms with Parkinson's. Um, what role did she play in shaping how you approach caregiving, either prior to the diagnosis or during that time? And did she sort of express her preferences to you, or was it more of an intuitive process that you knew what you felt like you knew what to do? I hesitate to even ask that question when we're talking about someone that's in their teens at the beginning of this process, but do you have any sort of context on that at all?
Yeah, I mean, I would say in some ways it's shaped by both. So both kind of her preferences, but also kind of my own intuition. I think, for my mom, she's always valued her independence
Mm.
and she's always valued kind of ha keeping her own dignity. And so for us, throughout this whole journey, it's always been about how can we make sure that we are being respectful to her independence and kind of being respectful to her decisions. So for us, for example, when it comes to her healthcare, she has expressed her desire to be at home, to receive care at home, and to be able to maintain as much independence as possible. And so for me, as her caregiver, alongside my family, has been how do we make that a reality so that we can support her wishes, but we can make sure that we're doing it in a safe way, and in a way that she can still maintain her independence. And I think, of course, as the conditions change and as the disease progresses, it's of course guided by a lot of kind of observation and adapting to the changes that we're seeing and starting to recognize those subtle cues of when I need to let my mom make her decisions and when I need to, let my mom really tell me how she needs me to show up, but also recognizing when do I need to step in and when do I need to support her and in some ways kind of adjust the way that I'm caring for her. So I would definitely say it's a mixture of both, and it's something that has definitely changed, and I know will continue to change as the condition progresses.
You gave us a little bit of context on sort of when this all started, how you felt. This is something I want to do. This is something that, culturally would be expected of me, within my family to take care of a loved one. And I think a lot of people will relate to that. But based on sort of, can you take us back to sort of how you felt at the beginning of that journey? And then once you're starting to navigate that healthcare system, advocating for your mom's needs, was there a turning point where you felt more confident, where you felt like I've got this? Is there something that sort of was a progression or an arc and sort of how you felt about yourself as a caregiver in this journey?
Yeah, so I would definitely say that during the early years, it was quite isolating, quite overwhelming. Especially as a young caregiver, where while my peers and my friends were focused on navigating schools and everyday life, in some ways I was navigating a responsibility that often felt overwhelming and invisible.
Mm.
It shapes so many aspects of my life, but yet it was something that most people around me didn't even know, didn't recognize and sometimes wouldn't even be able to relate to. And so I think for me, as the years have gone by, I have learned to figure out how to manage those overwhelming and like feelings and that isolation. But I think a big part of that has also been now recognizing myself as a caregiver. So you kind of asked me what was for me that turning point. And
Hmm.
I actually didn't see myself as a caregiver for many years. I often just, and I think like so many of us, we often just see ourselves as, I'm the daughter, I'm the partner, I'm the grandchild, and that was the same case for me. So I was just the daughter, that wanted to be involved with my mom's health, and that changed for me about 5 or 6 years ago. When I actually had a provider who, it was one of my mom's providers who actually called me out and said, No, you're not just the daughter, you're actually the caregiver. You're doing a lot more to make sure that your mom's health is as best as it can be. And so you're actually the caregiver. So I want you to recognize that role for yourself. I want you to own that role and take that role going forward. And I think for me that was actually a turning point where I, for the first time ever, saw myself as a caregiver. And I, for the first time ever, recognized myself with all these pamphlets or kind of all these posts that I would see about caregivers to say, okay, now I'm able to actually um I'm that role. I'm that caregiver and I'm able to take on that role and kind of uh move with that going forward. And so I think for me, that also in some ways changed even the way that I show up for my mom now. So the way that I introduce myself to caregivers, the way that I advocate for my mom's need, it gave me in a way the confidence to ask for more questions, to push back when my mom and I are not feeling comfortable about some of the decisions around her care. It also pushed me to request for me more resources, and not just for my mom, but also for myself as a caregiver. And I think from that point on, I've really started embracing that role more fully in a way, and it's also, I think, allowed me to advocate for my mom better, for my mom's care, but also for my own well-being. And just not even within healthcare, but even kind of within my workplaces, my
Mm.
relationships, my community, society as its own. I think it's for me that was really kind of that big turning point of okay, no, I'm a caregiver, and there's so much more that comes with this role.
That's right. It's such an important thing to acknowledge because no matter how much we want to sort of take on something like that for our loved ones, we definitely acknowledge the fact that it is certainly not the everyday experience of the average teenager or 20 something, or even maybe even someone in their early 30s. So I think that's really an important moment to consider. You mentioned a bit of isolation that you were feeling, which is understandable. Um, did you ever sort of find specific community or support during those moments that helped you?
I would say, in some ways, kind of that. I guess for me, really calling on to the role or recognizing myself as a caregiver kind of changed that for me, and kind of the ability to recognize that okay, this is something that I can't do alone. And so that's actually how in some ways I started sharing more of my story, and
Mm,
how advocacy became more of a kind of a central role within who I am. And I think I realized that the more I share my story, the more I came across others, friends, colleagues, even strangers who were also sharing their stories, who were also navigating similar situations, and who made me realize I wasn't alone. I wasn't kind of navigating these challenges and these difficulties and the ups and downs of caring for a loved one alone. And so it's helped me build a community of people that can relate to me. And now it's also helped me be more intentional about the way that I share kind of some of my caregiver responsibilities, and also the way that I ask my loved ones around me how they can support me. It's that transparency has really made a huge difference for me in terms of allowing me to show up more fully in all areas of my life, normalizing this in conversations that I have with my friends, my
mm.
colleague, my partner. Um, and it kind of really allowed me to make this connection to others that it's a reality that so many of us around us are going through, and so it's a normal part of our society. So how do we how do we get others to understand and to be more on board with what this entails?
And to surround yourself with the right people and put yourself in the right circumstances as much as possible. I just can relate to that. My caregiving journey was shorter than yours so far in my life, but I will say there were some people in my life when I talked about what was happening with my dad, it was just like a conversation ender. Like it was
Oh,
just, you
absolutely.
know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like it was just there was just oh, it was awkward silence, and that really helped me sort of navigate who the people that I could turn to in my life and who to sort of, with the limited amount of energy that I had at that time, who I was going to sort of, who were going to be my people. And it sort of,
Absolutely. And
yeah,
I think a big part of that is, we often think about the care circle of the person that's navigating that condition. But something that we forget about, and something that I've now learned for myself, is I also need to create and build my own care circle. So who's part of my own support network and whether that includes for my mental, physical, and emotional health, it's extremely important now for me to also prioritize and build that support circle and a kind of that Carla's circle of care. It's just as important as my mom's circle of care.
In Ontario, there are almost 4 million caregivers, just like you, who provide physical or emotional support to a family member, partner, friend, or neighbor. The I Am a Caregiver toolkit from the Ontario Caregiver Organization is designed to support you with practical tools to help you stay organized, manage stress, and navigate your journey. Now available in 5 new languages: Cantonese, Mandarin, Tamil, Punjabi, and Tagalog. The toolkit makes it easier than ever to access the resources you need. You don't have to do this alone. Visit ontariocaregiver.ca/managing-care/toolkits to download your free copy today. I want to talk about that concept of advocacy that you brought up and talk a little bit more about how it works in the workplace and advocating for workplace support. Did you encounter any misconceptions about caregiving from friends or from colleagues, family even, and how did you address those?
Absolutely. I think probably the biggest misconception I've encountered is that people around me often struggle to see me as a caregiver. And that's because there's this idea that a caregiver is someone who is retired,
Mm,
someone who is, caring for a spouse, who has financial stability, who has time, who has flexibility to be able to support a loved one. And so I think there's a stereotype that people often have when they hear the word caregiver. And so for me, when I would, share my story and kind of share parts of my role as a caregiver, I think a lot of people found themselves confused and kind of weren't able to kind of see, okay, but you're young or you're starting your career or you're just graduated. What do you mean you're caring for someone? And I think that's been a big part of my advocacy, and that's really a big part of why I share about my story is because I want to address this. I want to address the
mm.
idea that can caregiving can really impact anyone, regardless of age, gender. It can truly can happen to anyone from one day to the other. You may be caring for a loved one, and so I think for me that's really become a big part of why I share the reality of caring for someone, for a loved one at my stage in life. And how it's not just about caregiving, but actually how it's about managing so many different roles. And and how it's so deeply personal. It can be very rewarding and it can also be deeply challenging. And so it's my goal to really change the narrative so that more people or less people make that assumption that a caregiver is only, someone who's caring for a spouse who's elderly, but more people start realizing that it impacts so many more individuals around their community, around their workplaces, even their friends, who may be caring for a loved one.
And definitely, I can think of so many ways, especially if we sort of narrow down on our careers and our world of work. There's not a lot of professions where you're automatically just have the time and space available to you as a full-time employee, um, where you're trying to establish yourself, especially earlier in your career, that just like, oh, cool, you need an afternoon off here and there and here and there and here, and it starts to add up. So how have you successfully navigated or that situation and advocated for yourself and your caregiving needs with your employers?
It's definitely been a journey. So I would say it's in some ways been a journey of learning and then unlearning and speaking up. So, early on in my career, I really struggle with sharing with my employers that I was a caregiver. Part of it was, I would think it's completely separate from my work. I don't need to share, or the other part of me would often think there's nothing that my employer can do to actually help me. So I'm maybe putting myself at risk or any repercussion or maybe being passed for promotions if I share this part of myself. But it really impacted my mental health. I realized that at least for me, I bring my whole self to work. And so when my mom was having challenges within her health, I had a really hard time focusing at work and realized that that reality just wasn't something that I could do for me. And so over time, I realized that I need to share. I need to speak up. I need to have these very frank and open conversations with my employers. And I also need to find employers that are able to support me, that have the right structures in place, to have the right benefits. And even if they don't have them, that they are open to figuring out what that could look like to support me. Because I recognize that I am also contributing to a company. I'm bringing skill set. I'm bringing my experience, my knowledge, and I think it's the really focus here is that it's a collaboration. So I often think about it, now for me is I frame it as how do we have an open conversation? How do we figure out how we can both collaborate here so that I'm able to be successful in and I'm able to be there for my mom and her health, but that I'm actually also able to show up in my workplace and thrive and succeed and be able to support the goals of the company that I'm supporting for. So I think it's definitely been being a journey, I would say. And it's also kind of forced me to learn how to have these open communications and how to really focus on the idea that it's not just a kind of someone kind of doing me a favor, but really on the idea that this is part of a broader workplace well-being strategy for the long term. And it's something that more workplaces need to implement and more workplaces around Canada really need to start normalizing for how we can create the right structures in place to support people who are going through supporting a loved one while also wanting to continue in advancing in their career.
And so for that open conversation with an employer would look like, look, here's me, here's my situation as an employee in terms of my family and my needs, but this is what I bring to the table. Where do you see the ideal vision of that being from the employer side, how that they can sort of manage that as well? Or is there anything I'm missing from the employee side that you would bring up?
Well, I often think of this as these conversations are definitely a discussion, and in some ways you're
Hmm.
negotiating here. So it's not just kind of a single request for an accommodation, but you're really here coming into how can we negotiate so that we're both successful in this relationship here. And so I often think about how can we be proactive rather than reactive. And so how can we start these conversations? Where we, don't have the pressure of having to deal with a crisis or having to step out unexpectedly. And so how can we set the right expectations of here, this is what I need, or these are some of the practices that caregivers often need to be able to feel supported or to be able to manage the care of a loved one. And here are the ways that we can realistically kind of establish and build this within policies or processes within the workforce. I think the other part as well is really the idea of being solution oriented. So
Mm.
we're not just as an employee, I'm not just coming into these conversations as bringing the challenges and the difficulties that I'm coming across, but really trying to figure out how can we make it work here. So how can I also um, accommodate my needs to be able to meet the needs of my employer? How can I make sure that I'm contributing effectively to the goals of the company that I'm supporting? And the other part that I think is really important also for employers to recognize is that this is a shift we're seeing across Canada. So it's more we know we have changes in our demographics. We have an aging population. We are a country of immigrants, which means often we don't have those large extended support networks in place, and we're seeing more and more multi-generational households. What that means is more people are taking on the role of that caregiver. And so as employers, I often think that to be able to remain competitive, you have to be shifting to the needs and to the demands of the market. And so, how do you make sure that you are retaining that competitive, um, that skill set within your company? How do you make sure that, when an individual is going through a challenging period caring for a loved one, that they feel supported and that they will build that loyalty to you as a company in the same way that you supported that employer, that when you are having a challenging time, you are also willing to reciprocate and to support them. And in a way, you're for employers, they're remaining competitive in a market that is sometimes so challenging to hire for high
Mhm.
for very specialized skill set, how can you retain that skill set, and how can you make sure that you are kind of an attractive employer to individuals who are going through the situations?
You mentioned that well, we talked about the fact that you worked in healthcare technology. Um, did your caregiving responsibilities impact your career choices in terms of obviously the career that you went down, the career path working in healthcare technologies, but obviously I think what you're saying is it also affected sort of the type of employer that you chose as well and what you were able to negotiate. So, how did all of your caregiving responsibilities and journey factor into your career growth? And how do you feel at this point in terms of feeling supported in the workplace?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Influenced very much the field that I wanted to go into, and for me, that was healthcare. And the more I was in the space, the more I realized that I truly do believe that technology can make healthcare more accessible, more equitable, and can really allow us to expand care without the need to solely expand kind of that human resource perspective. So it absolutely influenced my choice to go into the healthcare technology space. I would say, through in a way trial and error, and as I mentioned, learning and unlearning, for me took a lot of figuring out what are the ways that my employer can actually support me. So for example, for me, that entails flexibility. So the flexibility to know that when I need to step back, when there's an emergency, I can step back. And again, it's been built through that open, transparent conversation with my manager, with my team about some of the realities that I kind of face on a day-to-day basis and some of the ways that it may impact kind of my let's like my flexibility, but in also in the same way of the other ways that I show up. So how I show up after hours, how I show up to make sure that deadlines and large projects are completed and are successful. Um, and so I think for me, it's been through trial and error, through having those very open, transparent conversations, to asking questions about what exists out there, what resources are available, but also the openness to how employers are open to be able to figure out what can actually work to support the working caregivers in that space. And I think for me, it continues to be, I think for me, it's kind of larger than just me, but for me, it's been about opening those conversations in workplaces um, that I hope one day will shift to larger, more caregiver centric and caregiver friendly policies and workplaces that can support more and more of the Canadians and Ontarians across the province that are caring for a loved one. Um, so I would say absolutely it shapes so many aspects of my career, and it shapes even aspects of where I see myself in the future, where I want to grow, and kind of where I want to make sure that my skill set can possibly contribute to healthcare.
Let's talk a little bit more about, we've talked about your experience, but how, in general, it has shaped your perspective on what caregiver-friendly workplaces should look like. Is there anything in particular that you would give as advice to an employer when they're setting these policies?
Yes. So I mean, I think we're seeing now more and more employees at all levels are starting to really have to balance caregiving for elderly ones, for younger ones, for siblings, and it's just a reality that we're seeing across the board. And so, as the needs of our society evolve, workplaces need to adapt. And I truly think that with thoughtful preparation and with a culture of openness, caregiving responsibilities don't negatively impact businesses, but they can actually, if we plan appropriately, we can actually positively uh, impact the business or economy in our society. So I think when we focus on fostering inclusivity, when we focus on fostering responsiveness to the needs of our employers, to the needs of our society, employers can respond to the needs by creating programs that can support these employees. They can, or governments can create the right supports, the right leaves, the right policies, and access to resources that are tailored to support caregivers. And I think a big part of that is ensuring that employees feel supported and protected, and sharing their kind of their
Mm.
caregiver responsibilities without fear of repercussion. I think it's a big part. And oftentimes, it's not, and again, I really go back to that idea. It's not kind of a one-off accommodation, but this is really a conversation, and a negotiation, from both a business perspective, but also from the caregiver perspective of how can we meet halfway to make sure that both me as a person who wants to continue growing in my career can be also successful in supporting my loved one through their health needs.
I love how you mentioned that whole thing where when we're looking at sort of specific changes that could make just feeling the ability to have that conversation in the first place, saying, because there's a piece of vulnerability there where I think many of us might be concerned that if we go to an employer and say, hey, look, this is my situation, that it's just going to impact their career trajectory no matter what. And that's the starting point, right?
Yeah.
Instead of that sort of piecemeal, like, oh, I need this time here, or this is happening, and not sort of giving the entire picture of what you're going through. I wish more of us really had that ability to just be like, look, this is my situation, and this is what I can bring to the table, and these are the solutions that I can find. Are there any other specific changes you'd like to see on how either our society or employers support caregivers? Those are two very different things, but they are interwoven.
I mean, I think in a way, actually, they're highly interwoven. So, for me, when I envision a future, I envision a world where caregivers are recognized, across society, across our workplaces, across healthcare, in the same way that parental leave is. So, I often think about the way that we need to have established, accessible, and funded supports that allow people to navigate this new life chapter, with the resources that they need at every level. And so, specific to the workplace, I often think about the same way that, new parents have, workplace policies like parental leaves, flexible hours, and even reentry programs that are well established across, I would say, almost every workplace across Canada. I often kind of dream of a world where caregivers could receive similar supports, similar structured leave policies, flexibilities, and kind of those options for caregiver reintegration into the workforce. Um, that would remove kind of those one-off accommodations, or that feeling of I'm asking for a favor here, but
Mhm.
rather more of a feeling of there's established system in place that I can access that is meant to support me when we're navigating these tough, challenging situations. And so I often really dream of that world and that society where we're really recognizing caregivers the same way that new parents are, not just only in the workforce, but also, in our communities, within our healthcare systems, so that caregivers feel seen, they can feel recognized, they can feel supported, and they can also feel protected to be able to navigate this chapter of caring for a loved one.
I agree. And even if we just look at the very basic, how our demographics are playing out, if we just look at the idea of our how much of our population is aging versus, you know what I mean, younger, if we just split sort of the generations, this is becoming increasingly a thing. And that's just
Hmm.
looking at the situations where you're caring for an aging parent. You know what I mean? That very, a little bit more of a traditional concept of how things work. Never mind situations like yours where it's much earlier in life for both you and your mom. But it is something that we're going to have to talk about more and more on an increasing basis. So I think that's very important. Looking to the future, how has your own caregiving journey sort of shaped or influenced the way you plan for your own future, both personally and professionally?
I would say it's definitely a core in so many of my decisions, and so many kind of my choices for both professional and personal life decisions. And that's the choice for me, that's a personal choice that I make for myself, and for the way that I want to be able to care for my mom. Specifically for kind of when I focus professionally. So as I share now, for me, it's extremely important to find workplaces that support me as a caregiver and that have the resources, the supports, and the openness to be able to have those open and frank conversations. And so it's extremely important for me to find those places and to make sure that I'm contributing to a company that I can stand behind when it comes to their caregiver centric or caregiver friendly policies and culture in its own. I think the other part as well is professionally, and this kind of intertwines both personally and professionally, kind of working in the digital healthcare space and also being so closely exposed to healthcare through my mom's journey. I'm often also thinking about the ways that technology can better support caregivers navigating this, in the way that we can use technology to care for a loved ones. And it's something that I'm often, still trying to figure out for myself and still trying to navigate, but I absolutely see a future where we can use technology to lighten the load on caregivers, but also to better coordinate and to better navigate the care of our loved ones, especially when we're looking at chronic, long-term conditions. So I would say it absolutely, caring for my mom has absolutely shaped, and it absolutely is very much central to a lot of my decisions. And in some ways, I feel, I think it's a privilege to be able to have that. I think it's a privilege to be able to care for a loved one and to have the ability and flexibility to care for a loved one. I think it's a beautiful and I think really much a part of being a human.
Mhm.
And so yeah, for me it's very closely to kind of how it shapes me and how it shapes my future.
Are you a caregiver feeling overwhelmed, isolated, or in need of support? The SCALE program from the Ontario Caregiver Organization is here to help. SCALE, also known as Supporting Caregiver Awareness, Learning, and Empowerment, is a free program designed for caregivers like you. With one-on-one coaching, group counseling sessions, and practical tools, you can find a balance between your caregiving responsibilities and personal needs. Maintaining your mental health is a crucial step in the caregiver journey. Join us as we unpack difficult emotional experiences related to caregiving and provide meaningful strategies to enhance your mental wellness. Visit ontariocaregiver.ca/scale to learn more. Now, back to our episode. If you had to sum up your caregiving journey in one word or phrase, this is distilling everything right down, what would it be and why?
Yeah, this is an interesting question. I would say, for me, actually, for me, water is actually a kind of a calming. It has a common sense to kind of my soul, and so and I enjoy a lot of water sports, and so I would say kind of for me, a sentence is maybe floating or flowing between worlds, and I think in some ways it captures how I navigate my multiple identities, how I shift between them, how I'm adapting and moving, and really that fluidity and kind of openness to adapt and to reshape and find my footing over and over again as life shifts and as things change with caregiving can be so it can be a journey of ups and downs. It can be so unexpected sometimes, and so it's often kind of that the shift and flow, and yeah, I think for me that's kind of a sentence, kind of that floating between worlds and flowing between worlds and kind of bridging all of these like different identities, that are kind of a core to me and who I am. And yeah, I think the movement rather than resistance.
I love that. And it brought me back to that Bruce Lee quote to be like water.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And it encapsulates all of that. So I really love that. Thank you for sharing that. What would you say to someone who feels overwhelmed by their situation as a caregiver, but is maybe not sure where to turn or hesitant to ask for help at this point?
I would say, I think caregiving is such a personal journey. It's something so intimate to ourselves and also to our relationship with the person that we're caring for. And I know how again how beautiful it can also be, but also how it can overwhelming it can feel sometimes, and how hard it is to ask for help, and how hard it is to realize, okay, I can't just handle everything on my own. And I think that's kind of part of the journey, and the growing and figuring out yourself with kind of caring for someone, is learning that asking for help is not a sign of weakness. It's not a sign that you're not doing your best for your loved one, that you're not showing up in the best way that you can, but actually it's a way to sustain yourself, especially when we're caring for someone with a chronic condition, a way to sustain ourselves for the long run. I think one thing that's extremely important is to have those open conversations with those around you, with your friends, your colleagues, your partner. I think for me, that has been very, very impactful in the way that I care for myself now, letting them know the way that they can actually support me, and the way that they can show up for me in a way that's practical, and in a way that, they may not be able to fully understand my situation, but in a way that they can know what I'm going through, and know how they can show up for me when I'm really going through those challenging periods. Um, I think another part as well for any caregivers is we have to remind ourselves the importance of our well-being. So our well-being matters as well. If I'm not well physically, mentally, or emotionally, then I can't show up for my mom in the way that I want to. And I learned this through, unfortunately, through a hard point a few years ago, when I just hit a breaking point, when I just realized I was burning out and I couldn't do it anymore. And I realized the importance of prioritizing my own well-being, the importance of finding those activities that fill me, finding those activities that give me a moment to breathe, and that really kind of allow me to recharge myself, which are extremely valuable to over like the long term and well-being of my mom. Um, and I think lastly, like one part as well is, caregiving can be really isolating,
Mhm.
especially when it feels like others around you can't relate, or like it's a reality that others are not going through, especially for younger caregivers. And I think it's really important to find people who understand what you're going through, and whether it's an online group, a support group, or a local organization, or even just a friend who happens to be going through a similar situation. I think it's extremely important to find that support system. It truly makes a difference when you can connect with someone who has been through something similar, and who makes you realize you don't have to do this alone. And I really go back to that idea that I think caring for my mom, I think is really a beautiful, it's a privilege to be able to do this for her, and to be able to show up for her in a way that supports her while navigating, a life-changing diagnosis. And I think it's not necessarily like, often people, will ask, it's like caring for your mom is a burden. And it's not a burden. Again, I think it's a privilege. I think it's a really beautiful and a normal thing of being a human being. But what I think is the burden is kind of the failure of multiple systems that are failing to support people who are going through health conditions, as well as their caregivers. And so it just goes back to the idea for me of how do we advocate, and how do we speak out about it, and how do we share with those around us, so that we realize we're not alone, and we realize that this is actually kind of a really beautiful thing of being a human, of caring for a loved one. So that those would be kind of my thoughts for someone that's just yeah, it's feeling overwhelmed, and is hesitant to ask for help. This is a part of human being, and part of human being is also asking for help.
Carla, I love the perspective that you have brought to us today. I really learned a lot, and the focus that you have on how this is a privilege and how you want to be there for your mom, which many of our caregivers have expressed as well, but it's such a positive perspective. And I think that you have really taught us so much about how to advocate for ourselves in the workplace as well. So I thank you so much for being on Time to Talk.
Thank you, Michelle, for having me here. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I'm so glad that we can raise awareness for other caregivers out there. Thank you for bringing me into this space.
Me too. Thank you, Carla. Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed this episode. You can access more details about support services on our website, ontariocaregiver.ca. Until next time, I'm Michelle Jobin, and you have been listening to Time to Talk, a podcast for caregivers. We hope you have a wonderful day.